Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Orbit Live event. Tonight we have two fantastic fantasy authors, Katy Rose and Melissa Caruso, talking about world-building fantasy. World-building and how they create their own fantasy characters and worlds. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So, off we go.
Okay. Katy, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Katy Rose Poole. I am the author of There Will Come a Darkness and its sequel, As the Shadow Rises, which just released earlier, or I guess last month, because it's October now. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you.
And I'm Melissa Caruso. I'm the author of the Swords and Fire trilogy, which is out in its entirety now. And I also released in June the first book of a new trilogy, The Obsidian Tower, which begins the Rooks and Ruin trilogy in the same world, different characters, 150 years later. So I'm glad to be here too. Yeah, and I see we already have questions. Do we want to just jump right into the questions?
Sure.
Okay. Ooh. Here's let's see. The first one up top is there's a lot of literal darkness in your titles and covers. How do you balance incorporating some darkness into your stories while still keeping them fun? This is a great question.
I think this is such a good question to start on because, especially right now, I think we are learning how darkness and light can coexist and how they have to coexist. So yeah, I mean, that's something that I think in my books sort of naturally comes from the characters, because the situations that are happening in the book are pretty dark. You know, there's murder, there's a religious extremist group taking over a country, there's a prophecy that predicts the end of the world. So I think that those sort of more lighthearted moments have to come from the characters and their relationships with one another. And so that's something that I'm always thinking about while writing these sort of very dark moments of the book is how can these character relationships kind of bring out some of that lightness, and like whether that's through banter or whether that's through some, you know, moment of tenderness between characters. Like that's kind of how I look at it. What about you?
I think that's all great. And I also, there's a couple other things I also do. One thing is I like to make sure that there's always some hope, even if sometimes it's hard to see what that hope is. Because I know as a reader, when I'm reading something where you're like, well, I don't have any confidence that this isn't going to end absolutely terribly for every single person in this book. It's a bit much for me to soldier on through sometimes, even if it's really good.
Right.
I like to have at least some narrative hope, even if the characters don't have hope, that maybe the reader can have a little hope that somehow this will turn out all right. And I also like to have my characters not entirely give in either. I think I love to watch characters as a reader, and also to put them through this as a writer, to have them leaning on their horrible, flawed coping mechanisms, but they're functional yet horribly flawed coping mechanisms, where it's like, well, you know, you're keeping on with what you're doing, but you're probably doing yourself horrible damage in the process. Oh well, but and also having those moments of humor, because I feel like that's something that a lot of us do, is when things are terrible, like you'll have like gallows humor about it, or just there'll be some little moment that's ridiculous, even though terrible things are happening, and you can just sort of appreciate that ridiculous moment and move on. Because life is like that. It's not like the world doesn't always just play into the mood of the moment. Sometimes it'll be like, oh my God, terrible things are happening. But then, like, you know, somebody just fell in a mud puddle. I don't know. And it's terrible again.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I feel like, too, like, when you have a story that is dark, you really, as you said, can't write sort of just relentless bleakness. I think that you're going to lose the reader that way, because for me, especially right now, I can't handle relentless bleakness. And I think that element of hope is sort of why I am drawn to these darker elements of stories, is because, you know, when there is darkness, having your characters have some semblance of hope or giving that to the reader, I think is very important and very cathartic. Especially, right now.
All right, let's see. We have more questions. I'm looking at the little poppy-uppy thing. Let's see. What is the best book you've read recently and the best TV show or movie you've watched? Okay.
I have been binging right now. For some reason, BuzzFeed Unsolved is all I am watching. I don't know why. But like the true crime seasons, I really couldn't tell you why. This is what I have latched onto, but that's what I'm watching right now. Highly enjoying it if you like true crime. And then in terms of books, I just finished a book that's not out yet, but I'm very excited for, called All of Us Villains by Christine Lynn Herman and Amanda Foody. It's coming out next fall, so a little while to wait there. And then I also just read Vicious Spirits, which is the sequel to Wicked Fox by Kat Cho.
That one looks, I haven't read either of those yet, but they look so good. Really
if you like any sort of like paranormal romance, but also it's like set in Korea, like it's amazing.
I just finished a book that's also not coming out for a long time, Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, which is like a wonderful, it's kind of fairy tale, but I don't know, it's like a very pragmatic sort of fairy tale. It's in like this very T. Kingfisher kind of way. And the characters are fantastic, and it's kind of creepy, but also a good comfort read, because it does have that exact kind of hope that we were talking about in those moments of humor. So even though things are creepy and sometimes things seem bleak, you really you feel pretty good about that these cool characters are going to pull through and and find a way out of this. And it's just it almost has like elements of like a little bit almost like Stardust, in that kind of like mythic feeling, but very much driven by female characters as well, which I really like. And that was fantastic. And I also just read The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart, which was also
that one.
Really wonderful, great, amazing world building, more creepiness with hope. Like the characters are, one thing I really liked about it is that the characters are people who are moving towards becoming better people, which you don't see as much as I would like. Their arcs are generally towards they're kind of good people inwardly to begin with, but they're grappling with hard issues, and you're seeing them make choices that are sometimes terrible, but sometimes actually good. Where bad things still happen, because it's just it's kind of a creepy book where a lot of bad things happen, but you can be like, oh, good for you. You did the right thing sometimes. And I like that. And it's the world building is great, and it's really atmospherically wonderful. And as for TV, so TV is one of those things that I don't get to do when I'm on deadline. So it's been a while. I watched, my family's always trying to get me to catch up on things with them. So I'm like 5 years behind. I don't know. I just started watching Mandalorian, and my daughter really, really, really wants me to catch up to where she is with Ray Zero, which is this amazing, very dark anime that has a time loop in it, and it's very brilliantly written, but not upbeat, super not upbeat. But yeah, nothing too recently. The closest thing I've done to TV is I'm starting to replay the Final Fantasy VII remake on easy mode as my reward for when I get enough writing done.
Oh, fun. I also find it's very hard for me to watch television shows while on deadline. And I feel like that's why I sort of gravitate towards nonfiction shows or cooking shows or competition shows, because I'm not having to balance a whole narrative in my mind while I'm also working on, whatever book it is that I'm working on. So yeah, I tend to do a lot of I'll watch Chopped and stuff like that while I'm on deadline.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, let's see.
Right.
Next question. Can you describe your editing process? And is it enjoyable, torturous, or both?
Oh, what a good question.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you should go first. I'm curious to see what your opinion is on this.
Sure. Okay. So my editing process, first, it tends to go in waves. First, both because my editor requires it, and also because this is just the way I would work naturally anyway. First, I'll do structural edits, which is big changes. Right now, I'm doing structural edits for book 2 of Brooks and Ruin, and I'm like rewriting half the book. Just doing things to raise narrative tension, changing where I start, bringing some things on screen that I had off screen but were really cool. I don't know why. Past me made some bad choices I have to fix. Deepening character, making character arcs more intense. Lots of big picture stuff. And then after all of the big picture stuff, which may possibly take multiple rounds sometimes, then I will go on to do some kind of scene level stuff. Where I'm just trying to make every scene as good as it can be and make sure the dialogue is flowing and the tension is there and the writing is good at the scene level. And then finally after that, I've got line level stuff and eventually copy edits, just making everything clean at the are there typos kind of level. But for me, structural edits are actually where a lot of my writing gets done. Like my first draft, I've had good first drafts. And by first draft, usually at that point, it's actually more like draft 5 because I'll get partway through and be like, no, and then start over or go back and fix something. But for me, a lot of the writing happens at structural edits because at that point, that's when I'm finally like, okay, I've gotten all the things I really wanted to do in this story will tend to really grab me and be like, do me now, and I have to get out all the parts I'm really excited about. And then often I'll have this really kind of lame, half-assed framework holding together these big moments that I'm really excited about. And then I really have to go back and write the rest of the story and pull that together into an exciting, dramatic, compelling through line, because otherwise it's just like, they do some stuff. And then this really cool thing happens, and then they do some more stuff. So I have to fix that up. So that's where I am now. It's enjoyable. I love the feeling of it all pulling into place and becoming a better book. That's incredibly satisfying, but getting there can be torturous.
Yeah, I feel like our processes are pretty similar, actually. I mean, obviously in like a professional writing scenario, most of the time you're going to move through edits with your editor, like the way that you laid out with like the larger edits first and then kind of drilling down into more detailed line edits. But similarly, I think I enjoy the revision process, not all the time. I just actually turned in my first like big structural edit for the 3rd book in the Age of Darkness trilogy. So that was really one of the most difficult like edits that I've done on this series thus far, I would say. And so it just can kind of depend book to book for me, I think, like what stage of the process things start to really click. I generally don't like drafting very much. So I think like you, edits is kind of more where I can start to kind of put together the pieces that I've laid out during the drafting process. The drafting process for me can be very chaotic and just kind of like, I need to get this done. I need to turn this in. I have a deadline, just like steadily charging towards that point. Although oftentimes there are those times when you have to like stop and be like, what is happening? But the editing process, that is kind of the whole thing is stopping and thinking like, what is happening? Why is this happening? Why did I make this choice? And sometimes you find a like somewhere on a subconscious level, you made this choice because you knew you wanted to do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you're like, I made this choice because I just did for some reason, and it's not the right choice. So I'm going to change it. So for me, I think revision is like a very cerebral process. It's very much trying to unearth kind of my own subconscious storytelling choices and trying to think about them on a conscious level rather than where they have been on this subconscious level, to really think about what it is I'm trying to do with a story, what it is I'm trying to do with each sort of plot choice. And yeah, it can be very mentally exhausting process, but I think like you, I really enjoy that sort of feeling of unearthing those pieces and figuring out the story versus the sort of breathless, wild charging forward of drafting, which can be very scary for me.
Yeah, the draft is very much like you have no brakes and you're rolling down the hill, and
Yeah,
who's
you're just like, just keep going. I'm like, no, I want to stop and think about what's happening. So yeah, and I also really enjoy editing because I do have that sort of second or sometimes even third and fourth voice in there, or person to bounce ideas off of, someone who has read this initial draft, whether that's my editor or a critique partner, who I can bounce ideas off of, who can help me sort of figure out that subconscious conscious process of like, what were you doing here? Why don't we talk about that? And talking about it out loud can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, we have actually the next question is related, which is, do you have any tips for revising a fantasy novel?
Oof.
I mean, I think that my number one tip is always like, don't be afraid to just redo stuff, to throw stuff out, to like try again and do it better. Don't trust yourself that you can do better. Even if you really like what you did, that you can do it better on a second try, and don't be afraid to make the big changes. Whatever you most don't want to do is probably what you most need to lean into.
I really would agree with that. I think the whole process of editing the first book in this series, There Will Come a Darkness, was finding out like the thing that I am like the most reluctant to tackle is always inevitably what like my critique partner or what my editor, my agent, or whoever it was who was reading the draft would be like, hey, why don't we look at this piece and figure out what to do with it? And I would be like, yes, I knew that. I knew it, but I needed someone to tell me that so that I would actually do it. Other advice, I guess, for me, another thing I would say is I tend to get really overwhelmed with revision and feel like I need to fix everything at once. And so if I'm working on, these bigger structural edits, I will get caught up in this sort of more scene level stuff and like, oh, this dialogue isn't right, or like I need to add this description. And it's been really important for me to just kind of like really take a higher level approach and like do it in stages. Otherwise, it's very easy to get caught up in everything that's wrong with the manuscript. And then you get to a point where you're like, well, this book is just bad. Because you're looking at all the flaws and you're thinking about all the flaws because you're trying to fix them. And then you're just like, well, it's only flaws. There's nothing good about this. So I think it's really important to keep in mind what it is you're excited about in the book. And when there are kind of those smaller things that need to be fixed, just kind of mentally put them aside and focus on the sort of larger story before you get down into that detail.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, because it's so easy to sort of go down a rat hole and wind up spending all this time editing a scene that you later cut, which is the worst.
I've so many times had a situation where I'm like, oh, this scene is like not good and I need to figure out how to fix it, and like spend days on it only to realize like I can just cut it. It's actually not necessary.
That's another great thing is really trust your instincts. Like if you feel resistant about writing something or really struggling with it, it's probably not just that, it's not that you're a bad writer. It's that there's something about that your instincts are saying, no, this isn't right. Either you might need to cut the scene, or you might need a different approach than what you're taking. Like if you're bouncing off it, there's probably a reason. And if you can hunt down what that reason is, and sometimes that reason is, oh, look, this entire section of my book is pushing in the wrong direction or something like that. And then don't be afraid and just fix that and embrace it, Yeah.
And on that same note too, I find sometimes when I encounter like a note from my editor, whoever, that I feel resistant to, or like I don't quite want to tackle, sometimes it's pointing to a problem that can be fixed another way. That it's like, this is an issue that my editor has pointed out that is like specific, but it's actually pointing to a larger problem that I can fix in some other way. And like I've had so many really fruitful discussions about that type of thing where it's like, this isn't working, but it's actually related to this overall thing that like can be fixed in X, Y, and Z way. So it's like those kind of interesting connections where if there is an issue, sometimes it is pointing to something else in the manuscript that can be fixed.
And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you can have problems that solve each other. Like,
that's always the best.
Yeah, like, I've had times when it's like, oh, this character needs something more, and this plot line needs something more, and then I'm like, oh, if I put them together, then suddenly, yeah.
That is always my favorite. I get so excited when I have like calls with my editor at the very beginning of a revision round, because we'll be like talking through all the issues and then just sort of like spontaneously brainstorming about like, oh, like this relationship needs more weight behind it, and also this plot line, like what if they were related somehow? And it's just like that's like the fun part for me, is like finding those connections.
That putting the puzzle pieces together and they click feeling is just the best part of revision. All right, let's see, we have more questions. Your world building has been inspired by historical cultures. What drew each of you to those specific periods in history? Do you want me to go first, or you want to go first?
Either way.
So I have I have a couple of cultures in my books, but the one that's most directly inspired by real world culture is Rivera, which was pretty directly inspired by Venice. And so a long time ago, I saw a really, really cheap plane fare to Venice from the US, or actually to Rome, but whatever. I wanted to go to Venice from the US, and jumped on it spur of the moment and went with no real plan with my husband for 5 days in Venice. And I had no time to plan, and we just wandered around the city on foot, and we got lost, and we wound up wandering all through it in all the places that aren't touristy, or at least they weren't back then, I gather. That's kind of spread. But just wandering around the city, and it was the most inspiring thing. And I was like, well, someday I have to set something here or do something with this, just because the feel of the place is so unique. And so, and then finally, when I had, I don't know, that must have been like 20 years before, maybe not. God, I hope it hasn't been 20 years. A long time, not a specified large number of years before I came up with this book, and just, I was like, okay, this is finally it. This is where I can use that Venice feeling, and plug it into this plot idea, and they would work really well together. And I was very excited.
That is such a great story. I love that. And I do find that travel is kind of one of those things that always, without fail, tends to inspire me, which is very sad right now when travel is not really super possible. But yeah, a lot of the world of There Will Come Darkness is inspired by sort of Greek antiquity and like classical Greek city-states. And this really came from a lot of this stuff that I did as an undergraduate history student at UC Berkeley, which is where I went to school. And I don't know, there was just something that, I mean, the first real spark for the world of There Will Come Darkness, I had the idea for the characters and certain story elements earlier than this, but the world really came together for me when I started thinking about the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which were these kind of somewhat mythic monuments that you have probably heard of, most of them, like the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is sort of what the Lighthouse of Nazira is based on. I'm sort of gesturing behind me. But I just sort of found just the idea of these monuments, which now we're not really sure if all of them existed. Many of them have been destroyed at this point. Really only the pyramids of Giza are like still around in their original form. That sort of became like an interesting entry point into this world. I think because in the world of There Will Come Darkness, there's this idea of the 7 prophets, which obviously can match up nicely with the 7 wonders. And within the story, these prophets have disappeared. They're gone. No one knows where they are. So that sort of felt thematically similar to like the 7 wonders in a way, where it's like these mythical things that are sort of a testament to these great cultures and empires that used to exist and now are, underneath the sea, or we're not sure if they existed. That sort of mystery element of it was interesting to me. And I think was sort of what tied it together with this idea about the prophets, which I had already had. That piece of it had already been in place. So yeah,
Let's see. Next question. Which of your characters has been your favorite to write? Oh.
I can never answer this question. Can you? Like your favorite? They're like my children.
No, I always have to say some of my favorites instead because I can't pick a single favorite. My favorite in Ricks and Ruin, I like writing Whisper, who is a chimera. He's like sort of a cat fox kind of weasel thing, and who's not very cooperative. I also really like writing Artist, who's a side character who's I don't know, both very much smarter than they kind of pretend to be, but also a bit of a troublemaker. And I like, I love all my characters. I love writing Ash, who is a stabby sword lesbian, and she's just a blast. Yeah, and in Swords and Fire, my favorites were probably I have so many. Always side characters, right? Because they're easier.
You know your character arc. You're just here to like mess things up for the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can just like come in and be awesome and flamboyant and do crazy things and leave. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I think when you have like those favorite side characters as an author, it does come across to the reader because all of the characters that you just said were like some of my favorites in the Obsidian Tower. So yeah, for me, I mean, I have 5 points of view in this series, and I feel like all 5 of those characters are like difficult to write for certain reasons and also really enjoyable to write for other reasons. So it's kind of there's always some point in the book where I'm struggling with one or more of them, and some point in the book when I am like, yes, I get to write another Beru chapter or whatever. But for me, I feel like I have really enjoyed writing Anton as a character. I feel like I'm always interested in characters who have kind of like that, like a dichotomy to them or some sort of contradiction to them. And I think he embodies that because he is this sort of very like carefree gambler, like ex-street rat kind of character. But at the same time, he has this very vulnerable side to him and this past that he's deeply, deeply frightened of. And so that sort of contradiction within this character is really interesting to write, both from his point of view and from when you get to see him in, other POV chapters. And then in the sequel, I really enjoyed writing Beru because she has very few chapters in the first book in There Will Come a Darkness. So we don't get to know her super well. I think I loved all of her chapters in There Will Come a Darkness so much. So I was really excited to get to delve deeper with her and see more of her in the sequel, because every single chapter that I wrote of her in the first book like surprised me in some way. And I feel like that, when that happens, that's always a sign that you're onto something. And she, I think, of all of the POV characters, has a sort of wisdom and nobleness to her that all of the other characters, I think, are just struggling too much with their sort of various moral quandaries. But I think she's someone who really has a sense of who she is and what she needs to do and what she believes, which, may or may not be challenged throughout the series. But I think that was an interesting perspective to get to take.
I just want to say that I really love how you have so many POV characters, but they're all really interesting, which is like, a lot of times in multi-POV books, there's 1 or 2 characters I'm really invested in, and the others I'm like, okay, you're all right, I guess.
You're like, let me just get back to...
Right. Well, yours, you really did a great job making every single one of them compelling, and it must have taken a lot of work, and I'm really impressed. So,
well, thank you. I mean, character writing is really my favorite aspect of writing. So anytime I get like a note that's like, let's like think about this character arc, like those are my favorite edits to tackle always, because I'm like, let me think really deeply about this character's psychology and like backstory and what they're doing in this book. Great.
illustrated. You can definitely tell because the characters are fantastic in your books. So
thank you so much.
Okay. Next question. How did you both start writing, and when did you decide you wanted to pursue becoming a published author? Oh, wow. For me, it was like I started writing before I could make words. Like I was drawing picture books and as a kid, and I wanted to be a writer from kindergarten when they had me fill out the little "what do you want to be when you grow up" forms. So it was an author, a princess, or an artist. And these were all non-viable careers.
All non-viable. Why not all three, you know?
Yeah. So I wound up going with author. So hey, it worked out.
You did it. I think kind of similarly, I have been writing stories since I was very young, and I actually taught myself to type because I didn't like handwriting for whatever reason. So I like learned how to type at like age 7, so that, which I feel like is not that strange now, maybe like probably 7-year-olds now know how to type, but back then that was not like most 7-year-olds don't know how to type.
Yeah.
But I had taught myself to do that so that I could write these little stories, and they were mostly like somewhat like transcribing like pretend games that I would play with my sister in our backyard. But the writing part of it was like always really interesting to me and something I was always doing. And my dad is actually a screenwriter, so I always knew from early on that this was like a career path that someone could have. Although screenwriting and novel writing is very different. But I think it took me a while to sort of like emotionally accept that this was what I wanted to do with my life. So, you know, when I went to college, I studied history, which is actually a great major to do if you want to be a fantasy writer. But yeah, I like, you know, had a career in tech for a little while because I was like, well, writing is a real career, but it's also a really difficult career to make a living at. So I need to like, be practical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, you know, I finally got that story idea that just wouldn't let go of me and like wouldn't leave me alone until I finished it. And that was Their Welcome Darkness.
Oh, that's great. I was trying to get, I think I first started trying to get an agent for a novel when I was like 20, 21. And it took me until I was around 40. So I had a long learning curve. All right, let's see. Next question. Can you let us know what your writing schedule is like?
Oof.
Oh, boy.
So, if I had one.
Mine is right now is kind of a shambles because, you know, I used to write. So my writing schedule keeps changing to fit my life circumstances because it has to. You know, before I had kids, I wrote in the evenings. That was my favorite time to write, you know, and it was after work. It worked out. But then I had kids and then I had to write whenever they were asleep. And then they got older. Now they stay up later than I do. So I used to write when they were at school. So the house was quiet. Now they're never at school because it's remote. Everyone's in the house all the time. And I have a puppy. So like, I'd really love to know what my writing schedule is right now. To get a lot more time. I'm struggling with this.
It's been really interesting to sort of with, you know, the quarantine and all of that, sort of figuring out what your natural rhythms are as opposed to sort of what has been imposed on us by various institutions. I find that I tend to be the most productive in the afternoon, which I feel like most people are either like, they're like really morning people or they work well at night. But for me, it's like 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's like that's, and I think what it is there's like this small element of last minute panic that sets in. And it's like a little bit of adrenaline that I need to actually get stuff done where it's like, well, it's 2:00 now and you have written 50 words. So get on it. But yeah, it kind of depends. It depends on what type of work I'm doing. So edits versus, you know, drafting. And it depends what else is going on in my life. And, you know, for a long time I was working full time while writing. And I would, work in the evenings and mostly on weekends. So yeah, it's always constantly shifting.
And it can be really hard. Like, I mean, I'm really not a morning person. And, you know, so, and when you have free time at a time, which isn't your best creative peak, it's so hard to try and retrain yourself to write during that time, but you can. It's just painful.
I remember I used to be really good at writing in the evenings, because that's when I had just trained myself to do that. And I would sometimes like go to the boba shop and just like sit there until 9 p.m. and write. And now sometimes when I'm like super on deadline, I will try to work in the evening, and I just can't do it anymore. Like I have lost that skill. Like it really is a skill that you build up.
Absolutely. Well, let's see. Next one is, what would your tips be for any aspiring fantasy authors out there? General tips as opposed to revising tips. Well, let's see.
My first tip is to read a lot of fantasy, but also a lot of other types of books, because when you're writing fantasy, sometimes, you know, you want to draw on other genre conventions. You want to know how to write like a really strong romance, or you want to know about like military battle strategy. So I feel like reading really widely is important for any type of writer, but especially for a fantasy writer, because you're sort of drawing from a lot of different types of stories and types of things.
I read almost exclusively fantasy.
That said, I also read mostly fantasy, which is great. Honestly, like that's what I like. So
yeah, but it definitely can help. I think that one of my, let's see. So I think there's a lot of pitfalls that it's very easy to fall into, specifically as a fantasy author. I think that it's good to read, when you do read some current stuff. I think a lot of us grew up with books we loved. And so we kind of have those living in our hearts and kind of informing how we write fantasy, which is all very well and good. But I feel like things have really changed a lot. For instance, you look at the way you approach prophecy in your book. There were a lot of books about prophecy when I was growing up that I read, but you really come at it from a different angle, and you subvert it in certain ways, and you're doing new things with it, you know. And I think that that's, I think that it's important as a fantasy author to both be, that being aware of new directions that the genre is pushing is pretty important. I also think the pacing is different now than back when I was originally reading fantasy. I think that people in general are a lot less willing to slog through the misty mountains for, you know, however many chapters, hearing about the beautiful scenery and how much you miss.
Tom Bombadil.
Like 70 pages I counted of Tom Bombadil. Like nobody would read that now if you didn't know it was Tolkien, and there was eventually going to be a great payoff. So like, yeah, I think that it's important, no matter how much you love the classics that you grew up with, to kind of like don't try to emulate them too closely, because it's a different era we live in now. I think remembering how the importance of with any kind of writing, but particularly with fantasy, stakes are really important. Personal stakes for your characters. Character is so critical. I think it's easy for fantasy writers to get caught up in world building and cool, nifty plot ideas, but character is ultimately what's driving your story and what's going to have people love your story, right? You love the story if you love the characters and you want to spend time with them. You know, and that's so critical. So think a lot about that and how to make the story personally excruciating for your characters.
Terrible. Let's make them suffer. No, I think that is absolutely invaluable advice, because for me as a reader, I will read anything if I am interested in the characters and if I want to see what happens to them. But you could have incredible world building, really cool concepts, but if your characters are boring, I'm going to put that book down. So yeah, I think that's really fantastic advice.
And also whatever you're most scared of or think you're worst at, really just lean into that and work on it. That's it can really feel tempting to lean on your strengths, but which is great, but you have those strengths. You don't need to develop them. Like, work on developing, don't be afraid of your weaknesses. Figure out what they are and really work on developing them, and just keep trying to level up as a writer, because of course you want to keep being a better writer. Even once you're published, you're going to want to keep being better. You want every book to be better than the next. So don't be afraid of areas where you wish you were better. Just take that as a challenge, and keep working. All right, let's see. If your books were to be adapted to a different medium, what would you like to see it as? Live action film, TV show, animated film or TV show, graphic novel, stage play, radio, podcast show, etc. Ooh, that's fun. I mean, my soul cries out for an anime, but I don't know that that's actually the best fit for my actual books. I just like that medium. I don't know. I would probably, I think a lot of fantasy is better in TV form unless the concept is simple, because it's hard to do justice in a movie. So I would probably lean towards TV show for me personally, or graphic novel, because those are the best.
I totally same. I like graphic novels, really awesome, and like some of my favorite storytelling has been like in that format in recent years. If anyone has not read Saga, do that. Or Monstrous, also great. And yeah, I find film as a medium for fantasy can be done extremely well, but I think it's also really easy to fall short of what made that book so special. And there's really great fantasy adaptations out there, and there's really mediocre ones. And I like the sort of shorter form television fantasy series that have been released. Like I feel like they're becoming more and more common. Sort of like, like The Witcher, it's like 8 episodes, whatever it was. Can't remember now. And I love TV. I've always loved TV as a medium. I sort of like came of age during, I guess, what we call like the golden age of television, when you started to get like these kind of higher budget, more interesting types of television shows. So yeah, TV would be cool. I wouldn't be mad about that.
Let's see. Are you full on planners for your stories, or do you tend to dive in before everything is fully planned out and see where the story goes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I sometimes feel like I don't know. I think sometimes it depends on the book and what I'm excited about, and what my deadlines are sometimes. But for the most part, I think I do try to outline books before I write them. I like to have a sense of, well, my plots tend to get a little bit complicated, and especially in this series, there's 5 POVs, so it kind of requires some piecing together how everything fits together. So I do outline, but I also kind of feel like my drafting process is always like, I'll write like 10 chapters where like everything's very detailed outline, and then I'll have to stop and like be like, what are the next 10 chapters actually about? Like, I kind of know where I'm going, and I know certain plot points I need to hit, but then I need to like drill down into deeper detail as I go.
Yeah, so I almost always plan everything out in advance, but in a flexible way, because I have that same thing where I'll write up to a point and you're like, okay, whatever I did for the outline, it's now changed, it's going in a different direction, and I need to rework it. And I have to sort of be aware that I really like planning, and I can do too much planning, and because I'm going to have to throw out some of it anyway, because things are going to change. So so I think that I'm at my best when I do that detailed plan for the near future of the book, and then a rougher outline for the later future of the book, and then sort of pause and flesh that out as I go. And when I revise, I come up with a big plan for the revisions, because a lot of times there's just like complicated logistical puzzles going on there plot wise. But I know recently I just experimented with, and this is not something that's published or anything. It was something I was doing on the side for fun and just jumping in without outline and writing, and it felt really good. And I didn't get very far into it. Just, got like I don't know, maybe like 10,000 words into it. It was like, ooh, and then I planned, but it was inspirational, building flavor and character and getting a feel for this idea, and then I stopped and planned. So and I've done things a little like that before, where I'm like, all right, if I have a sense of a character or a situation or a first scene, I might do exploratory writing first, but I've always got a plan. Because otherwise, some people can just jump in and go and actually go in a coherent direction. But I need to have at least some map for the road ahead, or I'm going to wind up in a ditch, overturned, surrounded by weeds, going, what happened?
I also find too, like, some of that planning stuff that I do is less about figuring out like all the pieces of the story and more about getting myself excited about the story and knowing where it's going, because I'm excited to get there and to like figure out what the sort of setup needs to be to get to whatever it is that I'm excited about.
Good one. All right, let's see. We just have 10 minutes left. So let's see. Was there a particular author who inspired you when you were growing up? I had a lot of authors I loved. I don't know.
Yeah.
I did the first book I wrote was when I was 10. I wrote basically a thinly disguised Anne McCaffrey Pern fanfic. So I guess you could say I was inspired by.
My early work was like thinly disguised Sailor Moon fanfic. So
The Hero in the Crown was a really big. I don't know. It just really struck a chord with me that like here is a flawed heroine who wasn't. She did awesome badass stuff despite, it being the girl didn't hold her back, or they didn't have to feel like they had to qualify that. But at the same time, she was not like a perfect person, and she had like health issues, and it was kind of awesome. So I really like that too.
I read a lot of fantasy when I was younger. I really enjoyed like Robin Hobb's books, and there's kind of a lot of stuff that I feel like I read back in the day that's still in my consciousness somehow. Like it's just sort of stuck there. And I always mention this because it was like one of the first long series that I got super into as like a very young kid, which is the Animorphs, which is not fantasy, it's sci-fi. But I really feel like something about that series just like lives in my heart a little bit, with like how it is with the kind of stuff that you read when you're super young that just gets absorbed into your being. And then there was other stuff that really inspired me, like anime, like as I mentioned, like Sailor Moon, like stuff like that, where it wasn't just, books and fantasy books, but all sorts of things. Yes, I'm so glad there's another Animorphs fan.
Let's see. Next, if you weren't writing fantasy, what genre would you like to write for? I am such a fantasy girl that I would find some cheating way to write fantasy anyway. Like, ooh.
Right. I would write historical fiction that has magic in it.
Yeah. Sci-fi with fantasy flavor. But it's really technology. Totally not magic. It looks like magic and feels like magic.
There's like Star Wars is like basically fantasy with in space.
If I had to write something that wasn't science fiction or fantasy, I might do mystery or something because I like murder.
I could totally see that. I feel like there's a lot of mystery elements to like the Obsidian Tower. And I feel like I would be very bad at writing mystery, so I wouldn't do that. I don't know. I feel like it would be like sneaky fantasy that's like disguised as something else.
Yeah. Everything's better when you throw in magic, right? You can take dead magic. Let's see, and I think we have one question left, and we just have a few minutes left, so that's perfect. What project are you currently working on that we should look out for next from you?
Always a tricky question to navigate because there's only so much you can really say usually before project is announced. I am working on the third book in this series, so that's That's pretty straightforward and no real secrets about that. So it's kind of, you have written a whole trilogy, so you know how this feels, but it is kind of strange to wrap up like a whole series that you've been working on for, in my case, it's been like 8 years of working on these same characters in the world. So it's kind of an emotional process, I would say. But I'm actually off deadline for that right now, so I am lightly working on what I hope will be the next series after that, which I will not say anything about. It's very, very early stages.
Well, I'm currently working on book 2 of Brooks in Ruin, which I'm very excited about. I can't really say much about it without it being spoilery. The whole book 1 was spoilery after about like page 70 or something. So I'm very excited for book 2 and then book 3.
You have to keep going. It's crazy. And they're like, I just wrote a book. Now I have to do another one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. What was that?
Oh, no. Oh. Please continue.
But book 2 is like one of the pieces of this trilogy I was most excited to write, actually, which is kind of weird because normally you think that book 1 or book 3 would be the most exciting. But there's sort of a pivot point that I'm really excited about that happens in book 2. So I'm very, I'm working hard on that and very excited to share it with everybody. And that's due out, I believe, next summer. As far as I know, I mean, we live in a world of uncertainty.
Who knows what the future holds? I like that you said that I felt that way about my second book, As the Shadow Rises. There was stuff that I was like the most excited to write for the whole trilogy in the second book. I feel like second books can be like sometimes the best part of a trilogy, Yeah.
So if you've got something, special you've been saving for book 2, it raises the stakes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Book 3 is hard. So you have my sympathy wrapping a trilogy and the pressure to do it well and stick the landing. It's very scary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And I, personally want to do it justice, not even thinking about, readers who I hope will be excited about it. It's just like, for me personally, I've been working on this series for so long and I feel like I owe it to the characters and owe it to all of the writing I've done so far, owe it to past me, basically. So yeah, but, I'm excited about it. So.
Well, I'm excited for it too. And I think the timing is just about perfect. And I think that's it for our questions. And we're just about at the end. So I don't know, was there anything else you wanted to say to wrap things up? Or is that too much pressure?
Just stay safe. If you're in the US, please vote. Seems like a good note to end on.
Absolutely. And thank you all for coming. And it was really great talking to you, Katy.
Great talking to you too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Bye, guys.
Everybody. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
The cover here in limbo. Great.